My home's entryway has been overflowing with shoes, hats, and all sorts of pocket dump knickknacks. So today I want to take this pile of pipes and this plywood and build a discreet and clever way to organize the chaos on Timber Biscuit. Alright, so I know I'm not the only one who has issues with things piling up in their entryway. For some reason, it just seems to be the go-to place to drop all your stuff as soon as you walk in the house. And that's especially true with a 5-year-old. Between backpacks and Pokemon cards, we're lucky if anything makes it to where it's supposed to go. So the goal for today's project is to wrangle all those items in a pretty discreet way. And we'll go more into that here in a second, but for now, let's cover the materials for this build. So for this project, I'm going to be building my cabinets from maple plywood, which is a little bit of a deviation from the Baltic birch we've been working with. And for the main support on the cabinet, I'm going to use black steel pipe to attach it to the wall. And again, we'll get more into those details in just a second. So the first thing I need to do for this project is break down all of my sheet goods. And to do that, I'm going to use a track saw and a parallel guide. Now again, if you watch a couple of the past builds, you probably haven't seen a parallel guide in the shop before, and that's because this bad boy is new. And I want to say thanks to all those in the comments who recommended I get one. You guys were right. I can already see that it's a huge asset in the shop, and it saved me a bunch of time on this build. And with that, I'll also say that you don't need a parallel guide to do a project like this one, but for cuts like this, it definitely makes things easier. So what I'm doing here is just breaking down my sheet goods into long strips. This just helps me to organize my parts for the next step, which is going to be cutting these down to their final width, and for that, I'll just use my table saw. Again, as I said in the last video, I'm only partially converted. So as I take out my shop lights with this long strip, let's fade to white and talk about the design. So the plan for this one is to use the black pipe to attach 4 cabinet boxes to the wall. And then from there, I'll thread the pipe through the boxes to create 4 individual cabinet sections. Those 4 isolated sections will be able to swing out away from the wall and give me a pretty unique and modern cabinet design that'll really help us wrangle in all that clutter. Oh, and while we're on the design, if you want the plans for this project, they'll be linked down in the description. Alright, now that we got all the goals out of the way, it was time to cut down those strips that we talked about earlier. And since these are pretty long strips, I'm just going to use my sled, but I want to use the longer right side of it to help support the majority of the workpiece. So what I did here was just set up a stop block on the left side of my blade and just use that to trim out the sections that are consistent. And when you're building 4 cabinets like this, there's a lot of parts that are consistent. So a stop block is a pretty good idea. One thing you may have noticed in the earlier drawing is that the lower cabinet is slightly larger than the upper 3. And that's because the lower cabinet is going to be designed for shoe storage. So that's going to be the only oddball cabinet sizes for this project. And again, that's only going to affect the height. Everything else for that cabinet will remain the same as the other 3. And while that cabinet may be an oddball, I think it fits in perfectly. Alright, so once I had all my similar pieces cut down, I could start working on some of the more unique ones. And to do that, I'm just going to lay them out with a tape measure and a straight edge. From there, I can bring the work pieces back over to the table saw and cross-cut them down in pretty much the same way. Again, since these are going to be a consistent width, but the height will vary based off the cabinet I'm building, I can still go back to using a stop block for some of the cuts. And unfortunately, there were a few cuts where I had to remove the stop block, then reattach it, because while Jedi Mind Tricks might allow me to turn on my dust collector, they don't allow me to expand the walls. One other thing I'll say is that with a lot of similar pieces like this, it's important for me to label everything. Because it's really easy with this type of project to grab a piece that you think is the right size, only to find out that it's a half inch shorter or longer than you intended for it to be. So while I'm not a huge fan of cut lists where you make all of your parts at one time, I do think with cabinets, if you plan ahead correctly, they're okay to use. And the reason I don't use them often is because I like to take my dimensions off my actual workpiece. But in a project like this where I've planned pretty carefully, I think it's okay to do. It's just like that time I wanted to organize a hide and seek tournament, but good players are just too hard to find. So with my cabinet sides, tops, and bottoms all trimmed out, the last thing I needed to do was cut out some strips for my shelving. Now, these strips are going to act as little stops on the front of the shelves, but they'll also prevent the cabinets from racking. Since a lot of this cabinet's design relies pretty heavily on good structure, I think any prevention that we can add for racking is a good idea. So while these strips are decorative, they're also pretty functional. So the last thing to cut out was the cabinet faces. And to do that, I'm going to turn back to my track saw. And the reason I use my track saw over the table saw is just because I don't have enough space. The width of these cabinets is about 25 inches, and that's just more than my crosscut sled can handle. Plus, trimming them out this way also allows me to have a grain match from top to bottom, which is a huge plus. This again falls into that planning ahead category. If you plan ahead in projects, you can do cool things like grain matches and other types of patterns with your plywood. So with any project you do, really try to think about the grain pattern and have fun with it. And speaking of having fun, if you're enjoying this video, please give it a like. It allows the video to spread to more people, and I greatly appreciate the support. Thanks. Alright, so with that final cut, all of our pieces are trimmed out. We can breathe a sigh of relief and do a little happy dance. Or two-step. I'm not sure what you call it. Alright, so next it was time to address some of those plywood edges. Now with Baltic birch in the shop, I tend to leave those edges untreated. But with this being home furnishing and this maple plywood, it's a different story. So here I'm going to apply some maple edge banding to my exposed sides to conceal those plywood edges. Now normally I cut my own edge banding, but on this project I decided to use this adhesive backed edge banding. And that's just to save myself some time as there's a ton of exposed edges on this project. So once I've snapped my strip down to length, I just use my iron at its highest setting and then go across the edge banding until it's almost too hot to touch. From there I just use a brayer to make sure I have good contact across my entire strip, and then flip my workpiece over and do the other side. I repeat this process for all of my exposed edges on all of my pieces. And when applying the edge banding, I'm careful to only apply it to two opposite sides because it's easier to trim that down over at the router table than it would be to do if I tried to do all the sides at one time. Even still, with this many edges, it's a lot of work. Alright, so once I have my initial edge banding set up on all my boards, I just use my chisel to trim everything flush. Here just use the edge of the plywood as a guide for the blade of the chisel. And then from there, a brisk tap of the mallet makes pretty quick work of this edge banding. I'm just careful here to make sure it's as flush as possible, because in the next step, it'll be a lot more difficult to attach the edge banding if there's a large hangover here. Kind of like Saturday mornings in my younger years. Alright, so earlier I mentioned using my router table to flush trim this edge banding. And to set that up, what I do is just raise my fence so that I have a small gap between the table and the edge of my fence, which gives plenty of room for the edge banding to clear. And then from there, just do a couple tests to flush up a spiral bit with the edge of the fence to make sure that I get a nice clean cut across my edge banding. I know there's a lot of cutters out there and other tools for trimming down edge banding, but I feel like this is the fastest and the easiest way. Another option would be to go with a flush trim bit and a palm router, but again, I think there's more room for error there, and this is a safer and more consistent way to do it. This is also why I left the room on either side, because if there was a lip all the way around my boards, I couldn't flush trim them this way. So once I was done with that initial pass, I could bring all my boards that needed it back over to the bench and apply the edge banding again, following the same steps we just did to reapply the edge banding. Pausing only for a moment to say, holy moly, then going back over to the router table to trim everything flush again. And then after about 10 more minutes sped up for your viewing pleasure, I could finally say, we're done. And while that winds down, let me take a second to say that if you're enjoying this video, hit subscribe. I make new videos about woodworking projects, tips, tricks, and furniture builds all the time, so hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Alright, so next it was time to move on to the joinery for our cabinet. And since you've already seen the machine, I'm sure you know it's going to be the domino. Now, I think there's a few different ways I could have gone about the joinery here, and that includes pocket holes, dominoes, dowels, or biscuits, but I ultimately chose dominoes because I think they have the most structure, plus they allow for good alignment. And this also helps me illustrate why we did the edge banding so early on this project. It's because if we don't, then laying out the joinery is going to move that edge by about a 32nd of an inch, or the thickness of the edge banding. And since we don't want that to happen, it's a lot easier to do all the joinery with the edge banding already applied than it is to do it afterwards. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'll say again, so much of woodworking is about order of operations. And that's no more apparent than it was when assembling these boxes. In order for everything to align well, I had to build these in a specific order. And that order was the right side, then the tops and bottoms, and then the left side. And the reason is because that right side is flush with the edge of the box. From that flush edge, I can pretty much nail all the rest of the measurements. And I've had more than a few people comment and ask me about how they should align their domino within their projects, and I'll try to do my best to explain that. What you want to do with any domino or biscuit or dowel joinery, you want to place your layout marks on the same edge or face. And then from there, with something like plywood, as long as you know that the distance between the base plate and the domino cutter is 10 millimeters, and the height of your fence on your domino is set to 10 millimeters, when you go to plunge your mortises, they're going to line up. And I know that that sounds really straightforward, but for whatever reason, when you're using a domino, it can be confusing. So again, the best practice is to keep all your markings to the same side or the same faces. And as long as you set the height of your fence to 10 and you use the base plate at 10, your dominoes will line up. And again, that should work for biscuits as well. Just make sure to measure the distance between your base plate and your biscuit and set the fence height in the biscuit joiner accordingly. I hope that clears things up a little bit. And if you have any other questions about it, just drop them in the comments. So once I've cut all the joinery for the tops, bottoms, and sides to be attached to the face of the cabinet, I could then use some squares to hold all my pieces in place and lay out the inside joinery. And then from there, just plunge away. Next, it was time to tap in the over 150 dominoes needed for this project and dry assemble my boxes. Now, the only downside about putting in all these dominoes is that we're going to have to pull them out to sand everything and prep everything for glue, but for now, let's not think that far into the future. So to assemble the boxes, I first attach the tops and bottoms to the sides, and then from there I can take that outside case and then tap it onto the fronts. Because of the domino joinery, putting these together any other way just won't work. And with that final tap, all my boxes are fully assembled. And they look pretty solid, which is a good thing, because for this design, they're going to need to be really solid. Alright, so with all my cabinet boxes assembled, I can start focusing on the holes that are ultimately going to support all the weight of these boxes. And to plunge those, I'll just use a 1 1/16 inch Forstner bit. And the reason I'm using 1 1/16 inch is because that's the outside diameter of my black pipes. And honestly, finding this bit was a little bit tricky. I thought I had one in my sets, but I didn't. So just keep that in mind if you're ever using black pipe in a project. From there, I can mark out my hole location on the tops and bottom panels, and then bring them over to my drill press and plunge in the holes. I did place a strip of blue tape on the back side of the panel to help prevent any tear out, but honestly, because of the rubbing that's going to occur on the pipes, it really doesn't matter all that much. I just tried to place that tear out on the side that would come in contact with the coupler, and that will make sense here in a second. One other thing I did was lay out a couple of support blocks with the same hole placement so that I could center that support block within the box to give me even more structure, which was honestly the thing I was most nervous about with this project. Because there'll be a lot of weight hanging out off the pole, my concern was that the cabinets would dip under the weight. And with this added support, it should prevent that sagging. And hey look, it works. So with the first test out of the way, I felt pretty good about the project. Next, I wanted to add a little notch to the top edge of the top box, much like I did on the coaster set from a few years ago. This will just help break up those hard edges. So while I trim that corner off over at the bandsaw, I just want to make it a point to say that a lot of the projects you guys see on this channel are prototypes. So if during the process I see something that I think might help you guys on your projects, or were a bad idea for my project, I try to point them out to you. So just know that if I build something and it doesn't work, I'm going to let you guys know that it didn't work. Unfortunately, most of the time I'm able to test things, but on projects like this one where there's no real way to tell if it's going to work or not until the end, I just kind of hope for the best. So let me know down in the comments whether you guys work that way or not. Do you want to know that something's going to work before you try it, or are you more of an experimenter? If you're a prototyper like myself, comment yeah prototyping. And if not, that's okay too, just comment sure thing. And for all the comments that start with yeah prototyping or sure thing, as always I'll make sure to reply to you guys first because I know you're paying attention. Alright, so with that, the last thing to do with this edge banding was flush trim it over at the router table. And with that last piece flush trimmed, I could finally embark on the endeavor of removing all of the dominoes. And what I like to use for removing dominoes is just a set of vice grips. I don't set them tight enough to crush the domino, but they're strong enough to easily pull the dominoes out. And I like to save my vice grips for my strongest days. You know, Saturday and Sunday. The rest are my weekdays. From there, I could sand everything down and then use some glue to glue my dominoes into all of my faces. And I glue in my dominoes to my face pieces first so that I can eliminate some of that stress during the glue up, which is something we talk about pretty often on this channel. After all, woodworking should be stress relieving, not stress inducing. At least that's the way I see it. Alright, so after I've harnessed my internal Happy Gilmore, you know, tappy tappy, I could go ahead and apply some glue to my end pieces. Now the assembly for these pieces is going to go just like it did for the dry fit, where we put together the two sides and top first as one piece, and we take the entire box over to the face to glue it on. Now normally the case there's a concern of everything being square, but since we use those dominoes to reference off the first edge, we know that everything's already square, so at least that's one less thing to worry about. With one side on, I could go ahead and attach the other, and then apply some glue on the back side and bring the whole piece over to the face to glue it together. One thing to watch out for whenever you're working with floating tenons is to make sure you don't flood your mortises with glue, as doing so could cause a lot more stress on the joint than you want and eventually cause it to blow out. And you definitely don't want to do that at this point because that would ruin the plywood veneer and probably your day. Alright, so with the outside of the cabinet all assembled, I could bring the whole thing over to the face and tap it on. Again, being careful not to hit it too hard and put any dents in the plywood or blow out those joints. From there, I could apply a couple clamps to the sides to make sure that those joints were nice and tight, and then take a couple of F-style clamps and apply some downward pressure on the edge to the face. And this clamp placement is pretty important because we don't want any gaps in the case, so here I just made sure to take my time to make sure I closed all those up. Again, this whole design relies on these cases being rock solid. It's almost like it was planned. So once I had all the cases glued up, I could go ahead and glue on that vertical shelf stop we talked about earlier. Now there's a bunch of different types of clamps and gadgets for gluing on strips like this, but blue tape does just fine, so that's what I use. And then since this box is going to be at eye level, I went ahead and installed a second shelf, which you saw in the earlier illustration. So all I did was mark the center of the box and line the shelf up. The fit on the box is pretty snug, so there was no need for clamps here. And then from there I could apply the stripping to the remaining boxes, and then go ahead and install my support blocks. And while I wrap that up, let me just take a moment to say that if you guys are enjoying these videos and you want to support the channel, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. There you'll get discount codes on plans and merch, and invites to the Discord server where we have monthly live chats and we talk about other woodworking topics pretty much all the time. And it's becoming a pretty cool place to connect with other woodworkers. Not to mention, you'll get a few free welcome gifts. So if that's something that interests you, check out the link in the description. And again, to all those who've already joined, thank you guys so much for your continued support. Your contributions make a huge difference. All right, back to the cabinet. So here what I'm doing is just taping off that outside edge. And that's because my plan is to paint the second cabinet from the top white. This is just more of a design decision than anything else. If you choose to do this project, you don't have to paint any of the cabinets, or you could paint all of them if you wanted to. I just felt like painting just the outside face would add a little visual interest. And white fits in with the light maple color. Feel free to tell me what you think at the end. Another reason I chose to keep this one more at eye level was because I was planning on painting it white, and I wanted to keep my son's dirty hands away from the white cabinet. But don't tell him that, because he'll probably find a step stool just to put his hands all over it anyway. Alright, so one more structural detail that I wanted to cover before I put any finish on the case was to create a small plate to put on the underside of all the boxes. This way it can prevent some of that crushing and rubbing that's going to occur from sitting on top of the coupler, and hopefully reduce the wear on the box bottoms. Originally I tried to find a washer that would fit, and I did, but unfortunately it was a little too thick and just wouldn't give me the support that I wanted. But this plate of aluminum ought to be just fine. And since it is aluminum, I had no problem using my woodworking tools to cut it out. And my plan was to insert a pizza joke here, but it was just too cheesy. Alright, so the final step was to install the angled blocks that are going to support the lower shoe shelf. Whew, that was tough to say. All I did was apply some wood glue, then use some CA glue and activator to hold them in place while the wood glue dries. And then from there, it was on to the finish. And for the finish on this one, I'm going to be using Osmo 3043. I really like the sheen on this satin finish, and if you've seen the Rubo build, it's the same finish I used on the bench. I'll put a link to it down in the description, along with a few other items from this project if you guys want to check them out. One of the best parts about using a hard wax oil like this is that if the cabinets ever get damaged or scuffed up, it's easy enough to sand it back and apply a new layer. Needless to say that repairability is pretty important on a project like this one. Alright, so the last step before final assembly was just to paint all of my exposed pipes with a white rattle can. I think this is just a nice added touch, and will look much better than exposed black pipes for my setting. From there, I could just start from the bottom, attaching all of my pipes and connectors, and then screwing everything into studs on the wall. And then finally, it was time to see this sneaky storage solution in action. And there we have it, a nice elegant solution to a clutter catastrophe. Well, maybe not a catastrophe, but you get the idea. I really love how light the entire design looks on the wall, even though these cabinets are pretty heavy. Though with how easy it is to use, you can't really tell. Adding that metal plate made the pivoting action super smooth, and I think best of all, it adds a ton of inconspicuous storage. I think hiding the interior pipe was also a really good call, because it makes it feel like the boxes are really just floating there. Plus the piping is super sturdy, so I don't have to worry about this whole thing toppling over. And when the boxes are closed, the pipe is pretty concealed, which again was the goal. So I guess now the only real challenge is making sure my little guy actually uses it. So if you enjoyed this project and you want to see others like it, make sure you subscribe. Check out this video over here next. And as I've said before, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.